Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Keywords event. I'm Helen Challoner, Chief Executive of Literature Works, and it's our pleasure to be programming Keywords at Exeter Custom House, the historic building on Exeter Quayside. We're delivering that for the charity that owns and runs Exeter Quayside, Exeter Canal and Quay Trust. And we're being funded by a grant from Arts Council England and also by the Canal and Quay Trust themselves. We've adapted in many ways to lockdown and COVID, and we've been very lucky to have Patrick Gale as our writer in residence, meant to be in the building for this autumn. We were going back into the building. Oh yeah, we did go back briefly, didn't we? Patrick's been working and writing and doing things, but obviously we had to go back online and adapt. So one of the things Patrick's been doing is working with a group of developing writers and emerging writers on first chapters and beginnings. And he's been meeting with them once in the building and then online after that. Everyone's been writing, and they are our key voices this evening. So welcome to Patrick, writer in residence for Keywords, renowned novelist, screenwriter, Cornish writer, and welcome to our key voices. They're all going to read. Patrick's comparing, maybe asking a question or two, and then we're incredibly lucky because Patrick will be reading himself from his novel in progress, Mother's Boy, which is about the Cornish poet Charles Causley and his mother. So that's a very exciting thing. I'm going to go and hand over now to Patrick. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Thank you, Helen. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm sorry we're not in the beautiful Custom House. Promise me that when lockdown ends and you can get to Exeter in person, you'll go and visit, because it's the most stunning building. First up of our very exciting, very varied buffet of writers, we have Carol Church. Carol writes contemporary women's fiction, and she's currently working on her second novel while seeking publication for her first. So if any publishers or publicists are listening in, take heed. Carol grew up, like me, on the Isle of Wight, and its landscape and beaches have a very strong influence on her writing. The island is the setting for both her novels. She spent 16 years working as a film and photography archivist, including 7 years at the BBC Archives. In addition to writing, Carol is an illustrator and working predominantly with gouache, watercolours and pen. Her book is called The House Was Everything. When globe-trotting photographer Rowan Henderson inherits a ramshackle Victorian house and cottage from her grandmother on the Isle of Wight, a place she swore she'd never see again, her instinct is to put it up for sale and continue with her unfettered life of adventure. The longer she stays at the house, working on its renovation, the more the past begins to tighten its hold over her. With the arrival of Johannes Müller, searching for answers about his grandfather's connection with the house before the Second World War, Rowan is drawn into the story of the two sisters, Eva and Isla, who lived there, the tragedy that befell them, and her grandmother's part in their fates. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Carol Church.
Hello, thanks, Patrick. So tonight I'm going to be reading from the beginning of the story of Eva and Isla. And it's set in the months in the run-up to the Second World War. Eva lay in the darkness as sleep continued to elude her. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall downstairs struck 11 p.m. She strained to hear, her ears finely tuned with the focus of a doctor listening to the beat of a heart. It was not the nocturnal echoes of her own house she sought, but those of the cottage next door. Gradually, the sound she was seeking found her. Isla, her sister, was laughing. Then, softly, music from Isla's lodger, Friedrich's piano, enveloped Eva like a warm blanket on a cold night. She listened intently, allowing the music to carry her out of the room. Eva wondered what they were doing and how she had ended up on the wrong side of the wall. Her husband, Arthur, grunted in his sleep next to her, and the spell was broken. Irritated, Eva got up and walked the length of the house to the bathroom, past 3 unoccupied bedrooms. Arthur hoped one day to fill with their offspring, God forbid. When she'd finished, she stood up to wash her hands. Her reflection floated up in front of her in the mirror. Like a spirit caught between two worlds, there was something unreal about the woman staring back, something unknown and untouchable. The following morning, Eva awoke to the noises of a house that had already begun its day. Mrs. Norris moving in and out of the dining room, the deep, gruff voice of Arthur ruminating on the excellent eggs he was enjoying for his breakfast. She lay staring at the ceiling as she anticipated her 2 favourite sounds: the thud of the heavy front door closing behind Arthur and the roar of their Ford as it carried him away to the surgery. Eva rose from the bed and padded over to her dressing table. Taking a seat in front of the mirror, she picked up a brush and began pulling it through her auburn hair, humming to herself the tune she had heard Friedrich play through the wall the previous evening. Dressing carefully, Eva considered what she would do as the day stretched out ahead of her. She was not particularly skilled at filling her days, even though those hours of freedom were some of her most precious. When Arthur returned for lunch, she would be expected to join him and make the necessary inquiries about his morning surgery. He would regale her with tales as riveting as the state of Mr. Ratchet's gout or the progress of the Greys' pregnancy and their impending triplets, the thought of which gave Eva a raging sense of terror in the pit of her stomach. Eva went downstairs to the study at the front of the house. It was very much Arthur's domain, but in those secret hours when he was at the surgery, she liked to sit in a large wing-back leather chair by the hearth and read. This attachment to the study had nothing to do with a desire to be closer to her husband, and everything to do with the view of the cottage garden it offered from its window. Eva looked up, alert to the sound of the cottage door opening and falling shut with a scrape. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. Too early for her sister Isla. It must be Friedrich. Her pulse quickened as she waited for a glimpse of him. Friedrich walked into view on the far side of the garden. He was wearing a plaid shirt, overalls, and heavy boots. His sandy hair was unkempt. A tingling sensation bolted through her hands and up her fingers as she imagined smoothing his hair from his brow. With his back to Eva, Friedrich walked across the wood to the woodpile and picked up the axe. Lifting it above his head, the muscles in his arms contracted as he brought the axe down heavily on the wood. The noise was jolting and unsettling. Friedrich stopped to mop his brow and jerked his head towards the cottage at the sound of a window opening. It was Isla. For God's sake, Freddie, darling, do shut up. What time is it? Isla's muffled tones floated down from the window and landed on the grass like fine rain. Freddie grinned. You complain now, Isla, but you will be happy when there is wood for the fire later. I'll be happy when I can get an uninterrupted night's sleep, Isla replied with that sarcastic tone of hers. Make me a coffee and I'll forgive you. Also, make it bloody strong and bring it up to bed. Eva heard the window thud shut. Coming right up, Freddie's reply fell against the closed window, landing only in Eva's ears. He smiled to himself, dropped the axe, and moved towards the cottage door, out of view. Eva sighed and sat back in the chair, wishing the thought of Freddie in Isla's bedroom didn't fill her with a murderous hatred for her sister.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Carol. The question I was dying to ask you is, do your experience as an archivist, do you think that has that inspired your stories? Because I know whenever I've spent time in an archive doing research, it's really tempting to go off down lots of rabbit holes,
Yeah.
Unexplained photographs and so on.
Yes, I think it certainly has an influence, especially on my early writing. And I keep wondering if one day I'm going to write something that's entirely set in an archive, because there are certainly plenty, it's certainly rich for tales and information, definitely. Yeah.
Is there a good archive on the Isle of Wight?
Actually, I think it's covered by the one in Winchester, which covers sort of the south. So yeah, so there isn't specifically
As
one.
always, Hampshire stealing the island for itself.
I know, exactly. Yes, yeah.
We don't approve. Well, thank you so
Yeah.
much for reading for us. And
No, thank you very much, and it's
can't
been
wait
great
hear
to be
about the
part of
rest.
this. So
Fantastic. Thank you.
thank you.
So next up, we have, by way of contrast, Jason Mann. Jason is a West Country-based journalist with a career stretching back 3 decades. He's written for a variety of regional daily newspapers, including the Western Morning News, and he's also worked in publicity in the telecommunications industry. North Cornwall, which is the setting of his novel, has always been a special place for him. He says, "I have swum and surfed there much of my life. In fact, my father was one of Cornwall's early lifeguards." Jason now lives in Torquay with his wife, daughter, and his dog Patch. He's going to read from us from his latest thriller, The Echoing Shore. The blurb for this is: "A lifeboat is lost off Cornwall's wild Atlantic coast, killing the entire crew. The cause is never fully explained." 10 years later, Kate Tregillis, the editor of a struggling local newspaper who walked away from a high-flying career in London, becomes obsessed with solving the long-standing mystery. The investigations spark a backlash of violence, hate, and threats in the insular fishing community of St. Brannock. At stake is the future of her newspaper, her love for a man who has his own secrets, and even her very life. Jason, welcome to the show, I want to say, and over to you. We look forward to hearing your reading.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and good evening all. Yeah, this is the opening scene from The Echoing Shore, and this is in the third person. It's taken in the form of a prologue. The rest of the story is actually written in first person. November 1991. Jim Trelawney tilted his head to admire the sweeping lines of the orange and blue lifeboat. There was a purposeful grace to the talon bray. Out of the water, she appeared immense, her 14-metre length filling much of the boathouse. But in the vastness of the North Atlantic, on a storm-tossed night, she could feel smaller than the head of a pin. A night such as this, in fact. A shrieking wind was conspiring with falling temperatures and hammering rain in some of the worst weather Trelawney could ever recall. The thud of heavy boots on the steps at the back of the boathouse and raised voices caught his attention. The Ridley brothers, Bobby and Jed, were exchanging angry words as they arrived. "We should get out whilst we still can," Bobby Ridley was saying. He sounded anxious as well as angry. Jed laid a placatory hand on his younger brother's shoulder. "Bobby, we need to keep our heads." The words died on Jed Ridley's lips when he saw Trelawney standing nearby. He smiled to recover his composure. "Don't go without us." Trelawney slipped on his life jacket. "Wouldn't dream of it." He hesitated, listening to the wild hostility outside rise to a new intensity. "Is everything okay with you two?" "Sure, never better." "So what have we got tonight?" "A yacht, in trouble, out beyond the moors, taking on water. 2 people on board, sounds bad." Jed Ridley glanced upwards into the creaking roof before looking around at the ruddy, weather-beaten individuals who had scrambled to the boathouse on this most God-forsaken of nights. The crew were quieter, more sombre than usual. Talk was confined to essentials as each man absorbed himself in checking and rechecking equipment and contemplation of the gut-wrenching enormity of the task ahead. "Where's Harding?" he said at last. Trelawney climbed aboard. "John's gone down with the flu." He nodded at a young man adjusting his life jacket. Seth stepping up to join us. The older Ridley locked eyes with the youngster, a smirk on his fleshy lips. "So, young Seth, you've been promoted to the A-team." Seth Maltby's open, unlined face expressed a steady confidence. "Looking forward to it, Jed," he said in his soft West Country burr. Trelawney smiled paternally at the young seaman. "You'll do just fine, lad. I was about your age when I made the first team." Thrumming hydraulic machinery raised the Talon Bray to the angle of the slipway, and the boat's twin Gardner diesel engines were already spewing fumes and starting to turn as the launch crew battled with the storm to fold back and secure the boathouse doors. A blast of wind and spray hit the lifeboatmen whilst they stared down at the heaving black mass of the ocean. Flecked with white froth, a wave rose almost to the boathouse itself before falling back with a slurping sound to expose most of the slipway. Holy shit, typical of Jed Ridley, he had expressed in one succinct obscenity the feelings of every member of the crew. It was going to be one hell of a night, one hell of a ride. There could be no going back, not now. Refusing to answer a shout when lives were at stake was unthinkable. The Talon Bray was lowered outside to be pummeled by wind and rain. Her radio and radar masts were erected, and then Trelawney, braced with a foot on the wheelhouse, waited for the perfect moment to launch. It was his call and his call alone. If he got it wrong, the rescue could end in disaster before it had begun. Everyone held their breath. They just wanted to be out there now, on their way. Those final seconds before the start were always the worst. Another surge of water rolled up the slipway, bubbling and frothing, seemingly unstoppable. Its power petered out just short of the bows. Now, Trelawney bellowed above the elemental roar and made a slashing gesture with his right arm. Jake Belitho, the head launcher, thwacked the retaining pin with a 21-pound hammer, and the lifeboat slid downwards, gathering speed behind the retreating wave. The Talon Bray hit the sea with a shudder, carving a deep, foaming V in its turbulent surface, to be clear of the slipway and under power by the time the next great swell of water loomed out of the darkness. It was a perfect launch. The launch crew climbed out of the boathouse to the road above to see the masthead light disappear as the boat charged into a trough, but then blink again as she struggled upwards, shrugging aside the churning water streaming across her decks. They'd never see the Talon Bray again.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jason. I'm dying to know, as part of your research for the book, did you go out in a lifeboat? I guess they don't really like journalists hanging around, but
No, I hadn't actually gone out in emergency. I mean, I've spoken to quite a few people. There's quite a few accounts of lifeboats over the years as well.
sure.
You know, various ones. Of course, the Penlee's the most famous in this part of the world, of course. But it's an amazing story, the lifeboats. I mean, you know, more than 600 people have lost their lives over the years. In the 20th century, I think there were 30 incidents where lifeboat crew lost their lives. So it's
and how have you coped with the sort of dread weight of romance that hangs over Cornwall? I think it's a big challenge for writers because there's so many expectations of a rather artificial, romanticized version of the place. And presumably, as a thriller writer and a detective writer, you wanted to show the real Cornwall, such as it is.
Yes, that's right. And I think mine is a story of Cornwall, but I guess it's also, for me anyway, it's a story of the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
And all that happens in it and the drama that takes place on the Atlantic. So for me, it was really important to have a novel that expressed the power of the ocean and how it affects people's lives who live on the coast.
It's really intriguing. I can't wait. Thanks so much for coming on, Jason. Bye.
Thank you.
Good luck. So next up, by way of contrast again, we have Teresa Henning. Teresa is once an illustrator and a writer, so that's going to be an interesting sort of double career for her. She says that she is constantly inspired by the scenery and wildlife of the Southwest Peninsula. At the same time, she's very aware of the threats posed by climate change. These two threads motivate her to write and to illustrate. Is she a writer who paints or an artist who writes? She uses both forms to reflect on the beauty and fragility of the South Hams environment in her story, Wistwater. This is involved from a piece that she wrote while undertaking a creative writing course in Plymouth College of Art. The title, Wistwater, references the repository of ancient knowledge of water sources and courses held in the bird community. This knowledge is pivotal to preserving the estuary, which is their home. Knowledge alone, though, is not enough, and so human help is sought. The characters, she says, as she got to know them, so the story is actually just one of a projected collection of Garnworthy tales. Teresa, it's lovely to have you on, and I'm only sorry that our audience can't see your beautiful illustrations. That they'll just have to go to a book festival and find a copy of the book themselves and see it in the flesh. Over to you, anyway.
Thank you, Patrick. Good evening, everybody. So I'm starting with chapter 1, setting the scene and introducing the characters, really. News reached Garnworthy, the heronry, fast. Bad news, fastest of all. The bird network was efficient, but given its makeup, not altogether reliable. In addition to the trustworthy sources, there were the usual gossips, exaggerators, and frankly, hysterics. Information had to be filtered, weighed, and judged. A task which was the remit of the birds of Garnworthy, and was taken as seriously by this generation as any preceding. Following the recent winter storms, the villagers were keen to undertake repairs quickly. Bridges needed rebuilding, the boundary wall reinforcement. Listening into their plans, the swans had realised the implications for those birds which fed and nested in the area, and decided to enlist the wisdom of the heronry. The work would require multiple deliveries of men and materials. The lanes connecting the villages were narrow, and so the river was often used as an alternative route. In consequence, the foreshore would be churned up between the tides and feeding grounds disturbed. The elders discussed with some scepticism whether the latest plans of men relayed by the ducks was a matter worthy of Garnworthy's concern. Some were firmly of the opinion that as it would not impact their branch of the river, they should remain aloof. Justice, with a slight raising of his wings, drew all eyes to himself. The elders among the herons listened. It was their custom when Justice spoke. The stooping gait was now fixed permanently by old age, and his eyes held the combined wisdom of generations of those who were the first to take to the air. It seems this time the ducks speak truth, intoned Justice. We need to accept that more visitors will retreat to this part of the creek, and we will make them welcome. There was a mumble from some of the younger herons, not quite of dissension, they were too respectful for that, but the implication for everyone of even less food to go around was clear. From the heronry, a black confetti of rooks carried the edicts to all the other birds. They might not like it, but they would all obey. Time had proved the wisdom from Garnworthy. Not all the birds engaged in gossip and banter. Care the egret kept his gaze firmly fixed on the watery world beneath his elegant legs. He was not entirely taken into the confidence of the other birds and was considered a slightly exotic novelty. He shared their heron ancestry and their patient style of fishing, but in looks he was a bright addition to the riverscape. He did not share the heron's ability to blend into their surroundings, in spite of their greater size. Smaller and lighter, his feathers were strikingly white, outlining him against the shoreline of silvered mud. His presence was noted with pleasure by humans, something usually only conferred on the stately progress of the swans, but he was less popular with the other birds who shared the river. The fact that he'd been living among them his entire life did not count for much in a community measured in generations. He didn't mix. His very presence was still challenged occasionally, usually by young seagulls. They harassed him, swooping low overhead, but he'd learnt to duck at the right moment. Or they swaggered across the mud to fish right next to him, trying to intimidate him. He had won respect for his courage in standing his ground, but he knew he was not popular, merely tolerated. He appeared oblivious as men worked on the banks and slipways, but his was a watchful, wary vigil. Perhaps because of his reputation as an outsider, he was last to hear of the departure of one of the river's most valued residents. Kerr had noticed, of course, the shoals had become smaller, but he'd not realised how great an impact fewer fish was having on some species. They didn't manage to rear any young last year and could hardly find enough to feed themselves, he overheard a passing duck relating. Who were they talking about? He asked Franz, the male swan. Franz was a long-time resident. Having raised many broods, he was a large muscular bird with a scarred beak, a legacy of fights to maintain his dominance, testimony that territories and boundaries had to be defended. In Kerr, he recognised a reassuring strength of character and was one of the few who would speak with him. It's the kingfishers, he replied. They're moving away. So many of their fishing positions have been cut back, and now this latest news of further disturbance on the bank in nesting time was the last straw for them. They'll be sorely missed, and I doubt they'll be the only ones to leave, he added grimly before gliding off. Kerr shrugged off the uneasy feeling all this had given him. Not his problem. After all, his family had moved north and made a success of living in a new country. On the whole, their decision had been vindicated. The kingfishers would surely find another river.
Lovely. Thank you, Teresa. I'm fascinated by this because, of course, you may not have intended to, but you're writing in a very, very old English tradition, because Chaucer did it first. This parallel between men and women and birds, because birds are so highly characterized. It's very, very tempting. Are you a bird watcher? Are these based on
I
close
am,
observation?
yes. I have the great privilege of being able to bird watch from my bed. I've actually got this window view out onto the riverbed that I'm writing about, so I can watch them all. Egrets and heron and all sorts of lovely birds to see.
And some of them, it's very, very hard to look at them just as birds because they are so characterized.
As you observe them,
I can never look at a jackdaw without thinking of lawyers walking without hands behind their back and so on.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And in the other Garnworthy tales you're planning, will they all be told from the point of view of birds, or you go to
I do introduce some people into the story later on.
Oh, people! But how about other animals?
But no, I'm planning on generally sticking with the combination of the birds and the people in the next couple of ideas that I've got in mind. So
brilliant. Yeah. Well, I wish you the best of luck, and thank you so much for coming on.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye. So next up, we have another Devon writer, Tracy Fuller. Tracy Fuller lives on Dartmoor and has written for as long as she can remember. She has published a short novel called The Silver Vessel, about a lifeboat, the Great War, and a dive show off a Sussex pier. Magazine, which is out now. When Tracy isn't writing, she likes to wild swim in the River Dart with her husband and daughter and ride her tandem Daisy across Devon. She's going to read to us from her new novel, Ossie Vessie. Herr Vogel is a German teacher. Herr Vogel is a spy. The kids think he is anyway. He shattered his body escaping from East Germany. What or who would compel him to go back? Secrets weigh heavily, but whose secrets is he keeping? And whose is he about to spill? Tracy, welcome to the show, as it were. And over to you. We'll look forward to your reading.
Thank you, Patrick. So this is the beginning of my novel in progress. It's called Ossie Vessie, and it's a spy story. So who doesn't love a spy story? Okay. Herr Vogel was our German teacher. Herr Vogel was a spy. Everyone knew it. It was the worst kept secret in the school. He hobbled when he walked. Jason joked that he had a limp in both legs. And before Herr Vogel came into lessons, Jason would lurch erratically around the classroom, Heil Hitlering to anyone who would look at him. We all fell about. Didn't feel at all disrespectful. Herr Vogel was a German, and we had won the war only 30 years earlier. My parents had been born during the war. My granddad served and shot down the first doodlebug, and now the Russians were threatening us with their cold version of the war. We didn't care if Herr Vogel saw us, and we didn't care how he felt. There was no evidence of him being a spy, of course. We had a passing idea that where he lived up on the cliffs would be good for signalling to the enemy, whoever they were. What he was signalling and why was never considered, nor what secrets could be gleaned from a grim 1970s comp on a windswept spit of the English south coast. It was said, in the dodgier parts of the second year, that there were strange lights flashing on the headland, Morse code signalling to boats in the bay. Presumably, he could have picked up the telephone to make contact with his spy friends, but most of us didn't have telephones at home, and any close follower of espionage knew that all the telephone boxes were bugged. In any case, Morse code was much more in keeping with the Enid Blyton books that I'd read. I wanted a real-life proper mystery to solve, and Herr Vogel had to be part of that real-life mystery. Why did we need to speak German anyway? What was he doing here? We'd beaten them in the war. They could just speak English, couldn't they? Herr Vogel dismissed the class. They jostled towards the door, pushing through like Throff on a tankard of beer and spilling out into the corridor. He hadn't had a decent beer in over 6 years. The peculiar English in their bitter, hoppy ale, not a match for a Steiner Pilsner. He picked up some balls of paper that had been flicked across the room. He didn't bother opening them to read their sordid little secrets or the spiteful racist nonsense that they wrote about him. He wouldn't mind so much if they could spell Gestapo. They had no idea. He rubbed his shin. His right leg was worse recently. He longed for a cold winter rather than the interminable damp of England that made his smashed bones scream. At home, the prefab bungalow had one advantage: an uninterrupted view of the sea. It was freezing cold in winter, and he sometimes wondered why he'd left Germany at all. The tenement in Bahnhofstrasse never felt as cold as this, even when it had been minus 20 degrees. Thrown up after the war, the prefabricated homes were supposed to be the answer to bombed out towns and cities, but they were monstrous in a southwesterly gale. Jerry built, people said, but it was British workmen who'd put up that shed. If the Jerrys had actually done it, there would have been some craftsmanship involved. He put the kettle on the stove, put a 50p piece into the meter, flicked a match, and lit the gas. The wall had gone up so suddenly. Now that was what he called building. Talk about Jerry built. That structure went up like lightning, catching lovers on the wrong side, splitting families. If you were on the wrong side in the morning, there was no chance of you getting back. And he wondered how many people having affairs never made it back to their families, stuck forever with the sweet bit on the side that became the main course and quickly turned sour. He'd seen a child about the same age as the children that he's teaching now, kicking a ball, watching the workmen with mild interest. A man, probably on his way back from work, scrambled across the waist-high wall. A split-second decision. He couldn't go back for his loved ones. It was then or never. A scramble, dropping his briefcase. The boy let go of his ball, picked up the case, and threw it after the man, from one side of Berlin to the other and into the Western world. He often wondered where that man was now, and even more often, what had happened to the boy, stuck forever in the East, having momentarily touched the West. Thank you.
That's a great start. Thank you. I'm really interested. Is this has the tang of remembered story? Is there a little bit of your childhood in there? Did you have a Herr Vogel at school?
Herr Vogel. I didn't, but I do know someone who did.
Right.
So yes,
Okay.
there is a little bit of stories, and I think, you know, there are so many stories of I suppose people escaping from this life that they were living, and then people wondering who they were and were they accepted when they actually arrived in whatever country they ended up in.
Of course.
So it's that sort of thing.
And
Yes,
the ones who ended up in England arrived here to find us still completely obsessed with the Second World War. I mean,
yes,
I remember when
yes.
I was a boy, everyone was reading those dreadful little comics, like
Pamphlet.
incredibly racist comics.
Yeah, awful,
Yeah.
absolutely awful.
But it
I
was
mean, and
completely
children
uncensored. Yeah.
can be, of course, so cruel, as we always
So,
say.
who in your head do you yet know who the audience for this book will be? Is it written for young adults? Is it written for grown-ups?
I think it's going to be written for grown-ups. It is in progress, though. I'm not entirely
Sure.
sure, but no, I'm aiming it for grown-ups at the moment. Yeah.
But I think quite often, stories just ask to be told, and then you can decide later. So yeah, really good. Thank you so much for sharing with us, and good luck with the work in progress.
Thank you very much.
I share your pain if you're having pain.
Oh,
I'm
gosh.
going through it too.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on. Next up, we are going into outer space in a big way. Our next writer is David Norman. David is a freelance aerospace software, defense, and civil communications system engineer and astronomer, and has served as chairman of Torbay Astronomical Society for most of this millennium, 18 years so far. He has worked on a wide variety of advanced technological projects, including Airbus, Boeing, and Gulfstream, civil airliner and military jet fighter and transport avionics suites. It was quite a mouthful. Several Royal Naval systems and, the real thing, Skynet. He is going to read to us from Helion Eon, which is part of a sequence of 5 novels he is working on. The blurb tells us, ask not, is our galaxy teeming with life? Ask, why is our galaxy teeming with life? Leaving a parting gift of a myriad potentially habitable planets, our galaxy's first deep intelligence departs towards a mysterious and distant destination. 5 billion years on, its evolutionary offspring are pitched in a pan-galactic fight for survival against a dark force seemingly bent upon their destruction. Are the Milky Way's sentient hadronic life entities valiant masters of their own ultimate destiny, or are they all mere pawns in a 10 billion year plan? David, we can't wait to find out. Over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Patrick. The first chapter of the book is actually available online, so I've chosen something slightly further in, which is introducing the cover character as a young lady, actually. The context: over 12,200 years ago, 10-year-old Kettiway lives with her mother, Amale, on the South African coast. Her father and Eon had earlier literally flown in to show Kettiway how to safely observe the solar eclipse now in progress. He has since left, leaving the future sight of her entire tribe in young Kettiway's care. Kettiway knew this was a critical and potentially harmful moment for her own health. Unlike those of her tribe who had not yet worked out where the action was, her father had worried she would be among the first to guess the true source of the strange light show sweeping the beach, and that, should she not know better, she might have looked at it far too soon. Of all his warning words this morning, those on the temptations leading up to totality had been the most dire. Over human history, he had ruefully recalled, countless curious sky gazers had seen their sight irreversibly scarred in seconds by staring up at a waning sliver of solar disk that seemed to invite observation, from each point of which still flooded heat, visible and ultraviolet rays well able to deliver rapid death to retinal cells. In concern for her companions, Kettiway once again raised her gaze from the rock onto which she was projecting the event through a pinhole clamshell, and looked around at what appeared to be the totality of her tribe gathered upon the beach, all now bathed less in sunlight than in silence. Relieved that none had yet suspected the sun was just about to disappear, Kettiway refrained from guiding their eyes too soon towards its still dangerous glare. although she was desperate to see what her father had described as beautiful beads of sunlight slipping through deep valleys along the edge of the moon, she fixed her sight instead upon the subtle shadow front suddenly racing towards them along the beach to their west. The instant that shadow swept over them, Kittiway was freed from the first phase of self-restraint her father had made her promise to follow. Moments later, 10-year-old human eyes were widening in witness to a wonder never before beheld by her tribe, a spectacular superposition of heavenly bodies few unearthly eyes ever got to see. Totality had arrived. The seemingly sudden transformation of their life-giving sun god from a brightly blazing heat source into a brooding black hole in the sky was far too much for anyone else in Kittiway's tribe to bear. Even their typically stoical shaman was, for once, reduced to hysterical wails of such genuine distress as to set his most blood-chilling of ritual death screams to shame. So, the instant the eyes of the elders around him fell upon his instinctive response to this heavenly horror, they and the rest of the tribe duly followed his dread-driven dive, face down and arms spread onto the sand. All that was, except Kittiway. Alone on that sand and giving her eyes a chance to appreciate the sun's new attire, she was trying to recall her father's words for some of the subtly brushed but stunningly beautiful swirls she was starting to see. Despite the deepening shadow that seemed to be sucking in a sea breeze across the beach, the sky surrounding the sun was far from dark. Indeed, along the eastern limb of the lunar disk she knew was blocking its light, she could still make out a thin strip of vibrant red, from which looped a fiery arc of orange that she presumed was what her father had called a prominence. Seconds later, the red strip too had gone. In its wake was unveiled the full glory of what Kittiway instantly recalled he had coined the corona. A myriad wisps of what she saw as akin to campfire smoke were streaming away from the central void, although clearly not equally in all directions. A distinct broadening to either side of the blackness betrayed the coronal binding above what she remembered as the rotating body of the spherical sun, of which the shorter plumes pointed out the positions of its poles. So enchanted had she been by the celestial spectacle that Kittiway was utterly oblivious to her entire tribe's panic-prompted prostration, in her mother's case, at her feet. From where Amali's tugs at her ankles, in an attempt to imbue some respect for their shaman, not to mention their obviously angry sun god, met with little sympathy. Tugs repeated and robustly rebuffed multiple times over the next 2 minutes and more. With each tick of totality, Kittiway's anxiety had been growing, partly in angst at the imminent end of an awesome event, partly for her promised refrain from staring at the beads soon to beckon the sun's brilliance back from oblivion, but more because her father had asked her to draw the tribe's eyes away from what he had deemed this eye-endangering dazzle. So, at just the right instant, her screams had set the shamans to shame. With that had ended Kittiway's first safely insistent sight of a total solar eclipse. It had been foreseen, yet no human could foretell the future day when the reflected dazzle of an alien stellar eclipse would be witnessed through the eyes of her soulmate, in the eyes of her soul similitude.
Wow, thank you, David. So, Haley Neon, is this the second novel?
This is the first one. That was an extract, and oddly enough, those were actually the final, even though it's in the middle of the novel, those were actually the last words I wrote, apart from editing.
Fresh off the
because
page.
Well, yeah, because the beta readers wanted to know a little bit more about Kittiway. I introduced her later, but they asked me to put in a bit more about her early life, so I put this in, and it also allowed me to deal with the language problems and things.
But what fascinates me is that you're planning. This is eons long.
Yeah, it's
novel
10 billion
sequence,
years,
as it were. And I want to know: are you carrying it all in your head? Do you know exactly where it's going to go, or are you going to stimulate yourself by discovering as you go along?
What's frightening about writing is you never quite know what's going to come around the corner into your head. But I do know now what the beginning and end of each of the 5 books in the pentalogy is.
Right.
So I can more or less put them down. And I know the main topics of the that I want to put in there. But once I get writing on a little bit, you just have to wait for it to flow. You have to get into the zone, and just hopefully it comes. And it is amazing the things that come into your head. There was a bit in the middle of the book. I originally once remember sitting down to write, and I thought I'll make it about an 8-page section. It ended up well over 100 pages with some of the major themes and things that I want to put in there.
I'm imagining your desk is full of post-it notes.
There's a lot of real science. It's real astronomy, real science, but in a science fiction way.
Fascinating stuff.
It's great fun to write. And doing the research is great.
Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you for helping us with
the
other meeting as well. Thank you.
So next up, we have Sonia Barker Harlow. As a teenager, Sonia wrote plays and kept a journal of her experience at a racially segregated high school in Southern Virginia. This novel she's going to read from partly takes place in America. After working as a teacher supporting disabled students, Sonia returned to writing 7 years ago and has since written 3 novels. This one, The Topiary Woman, is her most recent. Abby hates Mum for trying to shape her and neglecting the family. She doesn't want the future Mum hopes for her, but in order to move on with her own life, she needs to stop blaming her. Or does she? Stuck in a dead-end job, lonely 18-year-old Abby blames her mother for the family breakup. But is this justified? She revises her life, looking back to when things went wrong. The family moved to be near her older brother's new school. In the 1970s, there was no support in mainstream schools for children with autism. As the family falls apart and her dad's mental health deteriorates, Abby is left to look after her brother. But when his problems at school get too big, she tries to help him, landing them both in serious trouble. Can Abby put the past behind her and let Mum off the hook before her current life consumes her? Ooh, Sonia, we can't wait to find out. We'll look forward to your reading. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Hello, everyone. My story is told in 2 timelines, and I'm reading from chapter 5, when Abby's looking back to her childhood in an attempt to gain some understanding of her family. I was heading down to the kitchen when a glare got me from the stair window. The lawn was a snowy sea of white with what looked like a rock rising out of it. Andrew's closet tornado, which blew up 6 years before, came to mind. Our babysitter forgot to check on my brother, and Mum and Dad returned later to find their bedroom strangely bare. Next morning, Mum looked out to see the rose bushes festooned with her knickers and Dad's dressing gown draped over the lilac tree. Colourful shirts added brilliance to the summer border, and shoes grew out of the compost heap like fungus. But this seemed slightly different. The white was paper, reams of it ripped to shreds, and the rock was Dad. Mum was out shopping for the day, so I raced up to Andrew, banging on his door. "Can you come? Dad's sitting on a pile of paper." He emerged quickly for him and came downstairs after me, but then took time to put on his shoes, struggling with the laces. And even though it wasn't raining, he had to pop every single button of his anorak while I didn't bother with a coat. "Come on!" When at last he was ready and we reached the lawn, my brother's hooded eyes blinked. "Dad, you okay?" I asked. He was sitting hunched over, his knees under his chin, wearing just a vest and jeans. Kneeling down next to him, I felt his hand. It was stone cold. My breath clouded the air, but nothing seemed to come from Dad. "Don't die, Daddy," I said, rubbing his back to warm him. He just stared ahead, his eyes empty, like the windows of a house left derelict. "Dad," an intake of breath. He was alive, but something had switched off inside him. I began to tremble. At last he shifted, stretching his stiff legs in front of him. Andrew stepped forward, wringing his hands. Dad coughed. My nose stung and tears formed. Choking a sob, I bit my bottom lip. Suddenly, Dad pushed himself up and stumbled to his feet. My brother and I followed him as he plodded towards the house. Come into the kitchen by the range. I'll get you some tea, I said. Dad carried on through the hall and up the stairs. I felt like thin air, like I could be blown away. Dad had always seemed shut off, but for the last few weeks, it was like he'd furled himself away from us and was behaving as if we didn't exist. Was it my fault? My affection for Dad was running out. Maybe he sensed this. Making tea took my mind off stuff, calming me down, and I took our mugs and a packet of nice biscuits on a tray up to Andrew. Holding it with one hand, I knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again. Who is it? He asked warily. Just me. He opened the door and seemed pleased to see me, or perhaps it was the tea. What was Dad doing? On the lawn? He asked. I handed him his mug, offering him a biscuit. Don't know. Where is he? Not sure. Hopefully in bed. I don't think he wants to talk right now. Should we tell Mum? He asked. No. She'd only be cross. I'll clean up the mess. She's not back till 5. He screwed up his face but said nothing. A lump rose in the back of my throat as I watched him munch his biscuit. See you later, I said, taking my mug downstairs. Once in my room, tears dropped onto my lap as I sat on the edge of the bed. I could never cry in front of Andrew. As I stared at my feet, questions hammered inside my head. What was wrong with Dad? How had his behaviour affected my brother? Andrew had feelings, but it was as if they were locked inside several cocoons, like a Russian nesting doll, hiding another and another until he reached the small one at its heart. Often he seemed encased in his own world, and nothing much mattered to him except that he was provided for. At that moment, I longed for a normal brother who could talk to me, comfort me. Andrew was never fully there, so I never quite knew where I was with him. I gulped down the tea, which had gone cold by then, and went outside to collect up the shredded carpet. What was written on the ravaged paper? I didn't dare look, but knew it was important enough to make Dad stay up late. I wondered why he'd destroyed it, whether it could be salvaged. Many bits were too small to piece together, so I got a bin bag and stuffed them out of sight. But I couldn't hide the truth that Dad was broken. His story still untold, at least to me.
Wonderful stuff. Thank you, Sonia. I'm really intrigued. It's such a good title, The Topiary Woman. Could you tell us how that relates to the story?
Well, it's sort of a bit about, it's partly the mother's appearance, because she's got this great bush of hair, very wild hair. and she's incredibly clipped in her whole way of being. She's terribly sort of straight-laced and old-fashioned, and Abby's a bit of a rebel.
All about control, right?
Yes, and also she's sort of wanting to sort of make Abby kind of be a certain person. She's just like you have a bush that you want to keep, you want to shape like topiary in a certain way. Well, her mother's trying to do this with Abby, you see, and Abby doesn't want to be trimmed, you see.
Doesn't want to be clipped.
She doesn't want to be clipped in any shape or form, and she sort of rebels because she doesn't want to sort of go on to higher education. She wants to do art. She wants to go to art school, and she doesn't really know what she wants to do until her brother is settled, because there's a sort of guilt thing going on with her brother because her brother's disabled. So
poor parents, they never get it right, do they? Thank you so much for sharing with us. Anyway, Sonia, it was really, really lovely reading. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I promised our writers that I would join them in the ritual humiliation of reading unpublished work. So here is the very beginning of the novel I'm working on at the moment. This is called Mother's Boy, and it's historical. It's about the Cornish poet Charles Causley and his mother. So it begins with a chapter describing how his mum and dad met. You'll have to forgive me in advance if my accent, I'll have to try harder when I come to record it. This chapter is called Teignmouth. Laura was in the garden cutting a bay leaf and chives for one sauce and parsley for another when she heard the gate clang and, startled, turned to see him. He was tall, about 6'2", and dark and smartly turned out in a plum-coloured drill waistcoat, and had a matching cravat tidily tucked into a very well-laundered shirt. She took in no details of his face beyond that he was conventionally handsome, like an illustration in a library romance, because of the unconscious little boy held in his arms, who was bleeding from a wound to his head. The man looked so smart that it didn't occur to her to show him below stairs. Without a moment's hesitation, she said, "This way, sir," and hurried ahead of them to open the front door and lead the way to the parlour, where she indicated the couch below the bay window. Then he said, "What about the blood?" in a harsh Devon accent, and she knew him for a servant. "I'll fetch towels," she said, grateful, for the couch was upholstered in silk. There was a lavatory off the hall, a room whose luxury still surprised her, with a mahogany throne, a pretty view across the orchard, and a beautiful sink of blue and white china, which pivoted to tip its contents into a lead chute below. She fetched towels from the cupboard in there and hurried back to spread them over the couch, where he carefully laid the boy down. "Is he dead?" she asked. "God, I hope not. He ran out chasing his hoop, and I couldn't stop the cart in time. We were on our way to a patient." She saw him now, his high-boned handsomeness, and the way shock was draining the colour from his face. "I'll fetch hot water and bandages," she told him, thinking she should bring tea as well. "Afternoon, sir," she added to Dr. Butler, who had just come in. He was lame from a childhood illness and not strong enough to drive his own cart, much less carry a wounded boy. His black bag was weight enough for him. "Good girl," he told her. "A palmful of salt in the water, please. Have you witch hazel?" "Yes, sir." "That too. I apologise for intruding, but yours was the nearest house. The bearings are out, I take it." "Yes, sir." She hurried down to the kitchen. It was Mrs. Ashbridge's day off, and she had gone to her sister in Exeter, leaving Laura to make a cod pie and a red currant fool. Her employers were still out to lunch in Dawlish, for which she was grateful. She swiftly gathered together all she imagined the doctor might need. She was relieved to hear the little boy groaning softly when she came back in. "Concussion and a nasty cut," the doctor murmured. "He was lucky to be thrown clear of the wheels. Do you know him?" She took in the pinched face, the two large boots without socks, and knew him for the cheeky scamp who sometimes followed her down the hill on her errands, singing saucy songs and asking if she had a sweetheart. She nodded. "From the cottages," she said, and the doctor sighed, knowing which cottages she meant. "Are you squeamish?" he asked, and she shook her head. "Good. This'll hurt him, and you'll be a comfort." So she sat with the boy's head on a towel on her lap and held his hand while the doctor cleaned out the wound, then threaded a needle and stitched it in several places to hold it closed. She watched, fascinated that skin could be stitched and stretched just like cotton, and thinking of the stitching on the back of her best kid gloves as the child clutched her hand hard. She murmured to him, "It's all right, John. Soon be over. Brave boy." Nonsense like that to keep him still. And all the while she knew the other man's gaze was on her like a lamp. So thank you all very much for your wonderful readings, and thank you all, readers and listeners, for tuning in.